My ex-wife remarried a rich guy. I helped save the flight after running into her on a plane. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Just last week, I was living a quiet, ordinary life, then everything changed. Picture this. I'm on a plane, thinking it's just another routine flight, and suddenly, all the odds are against me. I'm staring at my ex-wife, who used to belittle me at every turn, now sitting helpless and relying on me to save the day. But it's not just her life at stake, it's hundreds of others. And I'm the only one who can make a difference. What would you do if the person who doubted you the most was forced to depend on you for their very survival? Stick around, because this story takes an unexpected turn you won't believe. As I boarded the plane, my mind was already in Miami. For weeks, I'd been counting down the days, desperate to leave the grind behind. Work had been unrelenting, endless meetings, deadlines that seemed to close in faster than I could breathe. I hadn't had a real vacation in years, and this trip felt like a lifeline. Miami's sun-soaked beaches and warm breezes promised the kind of escape I'd been dreaming about. No emails, no late-night calls, just the ocean stretching out before me, and nothing to worry about. Settling into my seat, I let out a long breath, the weight on my chest lifting slightly. I was finally going to get away from it all, even if just for a few days. The plane was filling up fast, the steady murmur of boarding passengers blending with the faint hum of the engines. I pulled my cap down low over my eyes, hoping to catch a moment of peace before takeoff. I wasn't planning to talk to anyone. I just wanted silence, a brief pause before life rushed back in. Then I heard a loud thud as someone dropped into the seat beside me. I barely glanced over at first, more annoyed than curious. I figured it was just another harried traveler. Someone juggling too many carry-ons and rushing to make the flight. But when I turned my head, my heart stopped. It was her. Vivienne. The last person I wanted to see. The ex-wife who'd walked out on me, who'd left me to pick up the pieces of a life I thought we were building together. She was dressed immaculately, as always. Designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly straight nose. Her lips painted that bold red I used to find irresistible and now couldn't stand. For a second, I thought maybe she hadn't noticed me. I considered looking away, pretending I didn't recognize her. But that was wishful thinking. She lowered her sunglasses, her eyes widening as she took me in. "Oh my God," she said, dragging out the words with that theatrical flair she'd always loved. "Is that really you?" I felt my stomach tighten, a wave of irritation rolling through me. "Vivienne," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I was too tired for this. Too tired for her games, her constant need to belittle and provoke. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the same smug expression she used to wear when she had the upper hand. "What are the odds?" she said, shaking her head like this was all some big joke. "I mean, you of all people on my flight to Miami. It's almost poetic." Her tone was dripping with condescension. I knew that tone too well. I'd heard it during our marriage, when she thought I wasn't good enough, wasn't ambitious enough. When she started to believe I was the anchor holding her back from the life she wanted. I looked away, out the window at the runway. "Just a coincidence," I said flatly. I didn't owe her an explanation, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into old arguments. She didn't take the hint. She never did. "You heading to Miami for work?" she asked, her voice light, almost teasing. "Or just tagging along on some cut-rate vacation package?" I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay calm. "Vacation," I said. "A break from work." She laughed, a sharp, mirthless sound that set my teeth on edge. "Work?" she repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. "I didn't realize you'd moved beyond. What was it? Freelance gigs and odd jobs?" I forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Things change," I said simply. "Some of us grow up." She raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying herself. "Sure," she said. "Sure, they do. So, what are you now? A self-made man? An entrepreneur? You always had such big dreams." Her words were laced with sarcasm, but I could hear the faint undercurrent of curiosity beneath the mockery. She wanted to know what I'd become, but she couldn't bring herself to ask without a jab. I thought about ignoring her. I thought about leaning back in my seat and shutting her out. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the years of hearing her voice in my head, telling me I'd never be enough. Maybe it was the sudden realization that I didn't feel small anymore. I wasn't the same man she'd left behind. I worked hard, I said evenly. I built something for myself. I take vacations now. That's how it works. She tilted her head, giving me a slow, condescending smile. Well, isn't that nice, she said. I guess even you deserve a little R&R. Miami must be a big step up from the backyard camping trips you used to talk about. My grip on the armrest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I earned this, I said. I'm not the same person you remember. Her smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something surprise, maybe even doubt crossing her face. But then she quickly regained her composure. Oh, I'm sure, she said breezily. I mean, it's been, what, years? People change. Some of us just move on faster than others. I didn't need her to spell it out. She was talking about her new husband, the one with the money, the one who'd given her the life she thought she deserved. She glanced at my watch, then back at me, her smirk returning. Still rocking the old Timex, I see. I didn't rise to the bait. It works just fine, I said. Some things are built to last. For the first time, she didn't have a snappy comeback. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her sunglasses and brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Well, she said finally, I guess we'll see who's really moved on. I didn't respond. I had nothing to prove to her. I turned back to the window, my reflection staring back at me in the glass. I wasn't the man she thought I was, and I didn't need her approval. The plane's engines roared to life, the cabin vibrating as we prepared for takeoff. I leaned back in my seat, letting the hum of the engines drown out her voice. This trip wasn't about her. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about me. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally moving forward. As the plane pushed off from the gate, I couldn't help but notice how Vivienne's presence lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. She'd gone quiet, for once, fiddling with her phone and pretending not to notice me. The overhead bins clanked shut as the flight attendants hurried through their safety demonstration. A polite smile here, a practice gesture there, but none of it mattered. The only thing I could think about was how many hours I'd have to sit next to her. I tried to remind myself that this trip wasn't about her. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was supposed to be my time, a chance to unwind, to clear my head. Yet here she was, all smug glances and silent judgments, a living reminder of the person I used to be. I had hoped for silence, but instead, I got this awkward limbo, filled with memories I'd spent years trying to forget. The plane taxied to the runway, the engine spooling up with that familiar, comforting rumble. I turned my head toward the window, trying to lose myself in the view. But Vivienne's presence was impossible to ignore. She had always been like that, taking up more space than she needed, casting a shadow over everything. I couldn't figure out if she was waiting for me to say something, or if she'd finally run out of things to mock. Either way, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I focused on the horizon, willing the plane to take off already. I wanted to be in the air, far above the city, where her voice would become just another background noise, muffled by the engines. Finally, we lifted off. The wheels left the ground, and for a fleeting moment, I felt weightless. The city fell away, its sprawling streets and shimmering lights turning into a patchwork quilt beneath us. The cabin tilted gently, and the engines roared with power, pressing me back into my seat. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the beginning of a journey, far from all the stress, the doubts, the memories that kept me awake at night. Yet, even as the plane leveled off, I couldn't shake the tension building in my chest. Vivienne, silent now, wasn't saying anything. That made it worse. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was charged, electric, like a wire about to snap. I closed my eyes, pretending to rest, and let the faint hum of the engines wash over me. The turbulence was light at first, the kind you hardly notice, but it was there just enough to keep you alert. I hoped it would rock me to sleep, but instead, it only made my thoughts churn faster. Images of Vivienne's smirk, the sneering tone of her voice, the way she always found a way to make me feel small, flooded back. I wanted to let it go, I really did. But it clung to me like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I shifted in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but the tension wouldn't leave. Then it happened. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the uneasy silence in the cabin. A flight attendant's voice, usually so calm and rehearsed, came through with an edge of nervousness. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew. My eyes snapped open. I glanced around, watching as heads turned, passengers whispering to one another. Someone had fallen ill, I guessed. It happened sometimes. My pulse quickened, but I tried to brush it off. They'd find someone. They always did. But the next announcement stopped me cold. If there is anyone on board who can fly this plane, please notify the crew immediately. A chill ran down my spine. The cabin went dead silent. I could feel it. The collective tension rising like a tide. The flight attendants moved quickly, whispering among themselves, their eyes scanning the rows for a raised hand, for someone to step up. No one moved. I heard a faint gasp from a passenger a few rows behind me. The woman across the aisle clutched her partner's arm. Every sound felt amplified: the rustling of fabric, the sharp intake of breath, the creak of a seatbelt tightening. Vivienne's voice broke through the tension, barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" She was looking at me now, her face pale, her composure gone. The confidence, the arrogance, all of it had evaporated. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. My heart was racing. I turned my head forward, staring at the seat back in front of me, as if it would tell me what to do. My mind was spinning, running through every possibility, every scenario. What had gone wrong? Did the pilots collapse? Was this some kind of elaborate joke? But no one was laughing. This was real. Before I knew it, I was on my feet, my body moving before my mind caught up. The flight attendants looked relieved, their expressions softening just slightly as I approached. "I'm a pilot," I said, my voice calm but steady. "Tell me what's going on." Their eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. One of them quickly explained both pilots had fallen ill. Something they ate, maybe. Food poisoning. They were incapacitated, unable to continue the flight. I nodded, not saying much, just listening. I needed the facts. I needed to know exactly what I was walking into. As they led me toward the cockpit, I could feel every set of eyes on me. The passengers were watching, whispering, their voices a mixture of fear and curiosity. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Vivienne's gaze burned into the back of my head. But I refused to acknowledge it. This wasn't about her, and it wasn't about proving anything. This was about the lives on board, about stepping up when no one else could. I felt the weight of it, but I also felt something else, a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't the man Vivienne thought I was. I wasn't the man I used to be. I had trained for moments like this. I had prepared for emergencies, for the unexpected. I wasn't about to let fear take over. The cockpit door opened, and I stepped inside. The scene was chaotic. The captain was slumped in his seat, conscious but pale and sweating, his breathing shallow. The co-pilot looked worse, his head tilted back, eyes closed, his chest barely rising. A doctor knelt beside him, checking his pulse, his face grim. The smell of the cabin hit me, a mix of stale air, sweat, and something sharp, like chemicals. I focused on the instruments, the controls, the glowing panels in front of me. The layout was familiar, but I hadn't flown a commercial jet in years. My hands hovered over the yoke, and for a moment, I felt the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a simulator. This was real. Over 200 lives depended on me making the right choices, on keeping my focus, on staying calm. The radio crackled, the voice of air traffic control cutting through the tension. "Flight 739, do you copy? What's your status?" I took the headset from the flight attendant, adjusting it quickly. "This is Alec," I said, my voice steady. "I'm taking over for the incapacitated pilots. Requesting emergency landing procedures." There was a brief pause on the other end before a calm voice responded. "Alec, we copy. We're ready to guide you. What's your current altitude and heading?" I rattled off the numbers, my hands already moving over the controls. The captain, still conscious, gestured weakly toward a checklist on the panel. "Use that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, grabbing the list, my eyes scanning the instructions. Step by step, I went through the emergency protocols, the years of training kicking in like muscle memory. The plane dipped slightly, and I adjusted the pitch, keeping the wings level. My mind was racing, but my hands stayed steady. I tuned out the noise behind me, the murmurs of passengers, the whispers of the flight attendants. My focus narrowed to the instruments, the altitude, the speed. I had to get this right. I had to keep everyone safe. This wasn't about proving myself to anyone, not to the passengers, not to air traffic control, and certainly not to Vivienne. This was about doing what needed to be done, about rising to the moment, about saving lives. The controls felt familiar, yet heavier than I remembered. I adjusted the throttle, checked the flaps, and prepared for the descent. Time seemed to slow down as I made the necessary adjustments, each movement deliberate, each decision calculated. I could feel the tension in my chest easing, replaced by a quiet determination. I had been through difficult situations before, but this was different. This was life or death, and there was no room for doubt. The runway was still miles away, but I could see it in my mind's eye, a safe landing. A smooth touchdown, everyone walking away unharmed. That was the goal. That was all that mattered now. And somewhere behind me, Vivienne sat silently, for once not knowing what to say. So what do you think is going to happen next? Will I manage to pull off the impossible and save everyone on board? Or will the pressure be too much for me to handle? Comment 1 if you think I'll succeed. Comment 2 if you think disaster is inevitable. The truth is, what comes next will blow your mind. So keep watching. I gripped the controls, my palms damp against the yoke as the cockpit hummed with a low, steady vibration. The glow of the instrument panels was the only source of light now, casting a faint green tint on the walls, my hands, my face. It was surreal. The radio crackled in my ear, the controller's voice calm and measured, but every word carried an unspoken weight. I felt the pressure pressing down on my chest, a gravity heavier than anything I'd ever felt at 30,000 feet. Outside, the world was a blank, black canvas. No city lights, no stars, just the void. The storm clouds had gathered hours ago, swallowing up the night, and now we were flying blind. Every slight bump of turbulence sent a jolt through the cabin, like a whispered reminder of what could happen if I made a mistake. I adjusted the heading, keeping one eye on the horizon indicator, the other flicking to the altimeter. The numbers seemed frozen at first, but then they started to inch downward. I could hear my own breath, loud and shallow inside my headset. The steady thump of my heart filling the spaces between the air. Traffic controllers clipped instructions. Maintain current altitude. Adjust course to 230 and confirm speed at 290 knots. I repeated the instructions back, my voice steady enough, though my stomach was churning. The radio clicked off again, leaving only the hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the fuselage as the plane shifted slightly in the gusts. The co-pilot's seat was empty now, his absence a stark reminder of just how alone I was. I could still see the outline of his body slumped in the doorway earlier, before they carried him out. He hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked at me. Just a limp figure being whisked away, leaving me to figure out how to guide this plane, this group of strangers, through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear murmurs from the cabin. The flight attendants were doing their best to keep everyone calm, but I could feel the tension seeping through the door. A baby cried for a few seconds, then stopped. The rustle of passengers shifting in their seats, the faint whispers of people praying, the muted clicks of seatbelts being tightened, it all created a strange, fragile symphony that made the cockpit feel even more isolating. I knew they were counting on me. I could feel their eyes, their hope, their fear. It was like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to block it out, to focus on the instruments, the instructions, the task at hand. But it was there, always there, that silent reminder that the lives of everyone on board rested on my ability to stay calm, to keep this aircraft steady. The turbulence came again, a sudden jolt that made my stomach lurch. I tightened my grip on the controls, adjusting the trim to compensate. The plane leveled out, but the rattling overhead bins told me that we were flying through rough air now. I glanced at the radar, the screen awash in green and yellow blotches that painted a grim picture of the weather ahead. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the edges of the clouds. For a split second, the entire cockpit lit up in a brilliant, eerie white, then plunged back into darkness. I braced myself for another bump, another roll, but the plane held steady. I exhaled, though the knot in my stomach remained. I had to keep my head clear, my hands steady. I'd done this before. I'd flown through storms, handled turbulence, navigated tricky descents. But this was different. This wasn't a simulator, where a mistake meant resetting the program and trying again. This was real. And real meant there were no second chances. The radio crackled back to life. Flight 739 descend to 25,000 feet. Maintain current speed. And advise when ready to adjust course. I responded, my voice steady, my words clipped and professional. The controller's calm tone was reassuring, but I could hear the urgency buried beneath it. They knew this wasn't a routine situation. They knew I wasn't the scheduled captain. I could feel their concern, their silent prayers that I wouldn't screw up. I adjusted the controls, setting the plane into a slow, controlled descent. The altimeter ticked downward, and I felt the faint shift as the plane eased into a gentler trajectory. The passengers behind me would feel it too, a small drop. A slight change in pressure. I hoped it wouldn't scare them. I needed them calm. I needed them steady, just like me. Another flash of lightning lit up the cockpit, followed by a rumble of thunder that I could barely hear over the engines. The storm was closing in now. The radar lighting up with more green, more yellow, more warnings. I couldn't avoid it. The only way was through. I tightened my jaw, adjusted the heading again, and took another deep breath. The intercom buzzed, and one of the flight attendants' voices came through. Captain Alec, are you able to update the passengers on our status? I hesitated. I wasn't ready to speak to them. I wasn't sure what to say. But then I realized they needed to hear from me. They needed to know someone was in control. Someone was doing everything possible to get them home safely. I reached for the microphone, pressed the button, and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Alec from the cockpit. We're currently navigating through some rough weather, but everything is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation as we work to ensure a safe journey. Thank you. My voice sounded steady enough, but inside, my chest was tight. I wasn't sure if they believed me, but I hoped they did. I hoped my words gave them even a small sense of reassurance. The intercom clicked off, and the cockpit fell silent again. It was just me and the instruments, the storm outside, and the faint muffled sounds of 100 nervous passengers behind me. As we continued our descent, the turbulence picked up again. This time it was more violent, shaking the plane hard enough that the overhead compartments rattled loudly. I could feel the plane shuddering, its metal shell groaning under the strain. I adjusted the throttle, trying to smooth it out, but the storm wasn't letting up. My heart pounded as I gripped the yoke tighter, my eyes scanning the instruments for any sign that we were off course. The radar was a chaotic mess now. The green and yellow splotches growing darker, more threatening. The controller's voice came back through the radio, calm but firm. Flight 739, we're seeing heavier weather ahead. Be prepared for additional turbulence and maintain your current descent. I acknowledged the instruction, but my stomach clenched. I knew what was coming, and I knew I had to stay focused. No room for doubt, no room for fear. I tightened my grip and kept my eyes forward, determined to guide us through whatever came next. The cockpit was starting to feel more like a furnace than a control room. My shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat, and every breath felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened under the weight of the situation. The faint scent of plastic and metal filled the small space, and the persistent hum of the engines vibrated in my chest. I wiped my palms on my thighs, and adjusted my grip on the yoke, willing myself to focus. Outside, the storm was relentless. Raindrops streaked across the windshield like silver needles, and flashes of lightning burst through the dark clouds, each one accompanied by a muted rumble of thunder. The plane shuddered again, the turbulence throwing it off balance for a moment before I corrected. My fingers moved automatically over the controls, but my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and calculations. The radio crackled again, a lifeline of calm instructions from air traffic control. They were directing me toward a break in the storm, a narrow window of safer airspace. I repeated their instructions out loud, my voice steady despite the churning fear in my gut. My knuckles whitened as I adjusted our heading, following their coordinates. But I knew the storm was closing in faster than we could escape it. My heart thudded in my chest as I scanned the instrument's altimeter, airspeed indicator, heading indicator checking, and rechecking. The numbers were holding steady for now, but the threat outside the cockpit was mounting. The radar display was lit up like a fireworks show, clusters of bright green and yellow swirling ahead of us. I tightened my grip and took a slow, Measured breath, trying to steady myself. Flight 739, we're seeing a significant downdraft at your 2 o'clock. Came the calm voice of the controller. Be prepared to adjust your altitude as needed. My stomach sank. A downdraft meant sudden, uncontrollable drops. I glanced at the altimeter again, my hands already moving to adjust. Copy that, I said, my voice even, though my pulse quickened. I felt the plane lurch downward, and I eased back on the yoke, pulling us level again. The turbulence was getting worse, each bump more violent than the last. The passengers behind me must have been gripping their armrests by now, and I could only imagine the fear that must be spreading through the cabin. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that I couldn't afford to think about them right now. I had to keep this plane in the air, had to guide it through the storm. Everything else was a distraction. Another flash of lightning lit up the cockpit, and I caught a glimpse of the co-pilot's seat beside me. It was empty. Of course he was still unconscious in the back. I thought of the moment they carried him out, the limp way his head tilted against his shoulder, his face pale and clammy. I had barely had time to process it then, but now the image stuck in my mind, a reminder of just how alone I was up here. No one else to consult, no one to share the responsibility, just me. My jaw tightened as I leaned forward, scanning the radar again. The storm's core was still ahead, its bright yellow mass creeping closer. I knew we didn't have long before we hit it full force. The plane jolted again, this time harder, and I felt my stomach lurch. My fingers tightened instinctively, pulling back on the controls to steady us. I adjusted the throttle, my eyes darting between the airspeed indicator and the artificial horizon. The instruments told me we were still stable, but my body told me otherwise. The constant shaking, the deafening roar of the wind outside, the erratic way the plane seemed to buck against my commands, it was all becoming overwhelming. I forced myself to take another breath, slow and deep. I couldn't let the fear take over. Not now. The intercom buzzed, and one of the flight attendants' voices came through. Shaky but calm. Captain Alec, we're noticing increased turbulence in the cabin. Do you have an update for the passengers? My throat tightened. What could I say that wouldn't sound like a lie? That everything was under control? That we weren't flying straight into the worst of the storm? I reached for the intercom and pressed the button. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Alec in the cockpit. We're experiencing some turbulence due to the weather, but we're in contact with air traffic control and following their instructions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll get through this. Thank you. I released the button, my hand trembling slightly. I hated the vagueness, the false reassurance, but what choice did I have? I couldn't tell them the truth, not when I wasn't sure of it myself. The turbulence worsened. The plane dropped suddenly, a gut-wrenching freefall that lasted only a moment, but felt like an eternity. A sharp intake of breath escaped me as I pulled back on the controls, trying to regain altitude. My ears popped with the sudden pressure change, and I clenched my jaw, determined to hold steady. The instruments still showed we were on course, but the physical reality told a different story. I could feel the plane fighting me, the storm pushing back against every adjustment I made. My hands were damp with sweat again, my muscles aching from the constant effort to keep the yoke steady. Flight 739, we're tracking heavier turbulence ahead. Suggest reducing speed and descending to 20,000 feet, came the controller's voice. I acknowledged the instruction and carefully adjusted the throttle, slowing us down as the altimeter needle inched lower. The wind screamed against the fuselage, the rain pounding like 1,000 tiny hammers on the windshield. The clouds outside were an endless, swirling gray, broken only by the occasional flash of white lightning. Each time the cockpit lit up, it revealed a scene of controlled chaos, flashing warning lights, bouncing gauges, and my own strained reflection in the glass. I tried to tune out the noise, the rattling, the murmurs from the cabin. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, to trust my training and instincts. But the weight of the situation was crushing. I wasn't just flying through a storm, I was carrying the lives of everyone on board. Every move I made had to be precise. There was no room for error. The thought made my chest tighten, made my breathing quicken. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, willing myself to stay calm. When I opened them, the radar was still glowing, the storm still ahead. But I could do this. I had to. Another jolt, another drop, and the plane shuddered violently. I could hear items falling in the cabin behind me, muffled thuds that made my stomach churn. I adjusted again, leveling us out, trying to smooth the ride as best I could. My voice shook as I spoke into the radio. Flight 739, experiencing severe turbulence. Reducing altitude and adjusting speed as directed. The response from the controller was quick, calm, but I barely heard it. My focus was on the controls, on keeping the plane steady, on not giving in to the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Through it all, I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself think too far ahead. I couldn't let myself wonder how I'd feel once we landed, if we landed. I had to stay in this moment, this second, this choice. It was the only way forward. The storm wasn't going to let up, and I wasn't going to let it win. My hands gripped the yoke tighter, my eyes fixed on the instruments, my mind focused on one thing, survival. The turbulence wasn't letting up. Each jolt felt sharper, more unpredictable, as though the storm had come alive and was actively trying to rip the plane apart. My hands stayed locked on the yoke, muscles aching from the constant strain of holding steady. I adjusted the trim, eased back on the throttle any tiny movement I could make to smooth the ride. Even a little. The instruments glowed in the dim light of the cockpit, their steady presence a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around us. The artificial horizon wavered slightly before settling, and the altimeter ticked downward in careful increments. My heart thumped in time with the engine's drone, a rhythm that kept me anchored. No matter how wild it got outside, I had to stay calm. I had to be the calm. Outside the windshield, the storm raged on. The rain wasn't just falling, it was slamming against the glass, streaking in silver sheets that refracted each lightning flash. The sky was a kaleidoscope of grays and blacks, broken only by those brief, blinding bursts of white. Every time the lightning struck, the cockpit lit up for a split second, turning the familiar dials and switches into something alien. In that moment of illumination, I could see my reflection, tight jaw, furrowed brow, eyes darting from one gauge to the next. Then darkness again, as if the storm swallowed the light whole. I didn't have time to think about the passengers in the back. Their muffled gasps and occasional cries made their way through the cockpit door, reminding me that I wasn't alone up here. They were scared. Of course they were. I imagined them gripping the armrests, knuckles white, as they braced for the next drop. Some might be whispering prayers. Others holding hands, desperately trying to reassure each other. But I couldn't think about that. Not now. Not when I had to keep the plane steady. Had to focus on the instruments, and the voices coming through the radio. Flight 739 maintain current heading, and prepare for descent to 18,000 feet. Came the steady voice from air traffic control. I repeated the instruction back, my voice calm, almost too calm, considering how tight my chest felt. The headset pressed against my ears, blocking out the storm's roar, but not the sense of urgency. I adjusted the controls, setting the plane into a gradual descent. The altimeter's needle began to drop again, and I could feel the shift as we lost altitude. The turbulence eased, just for a moment, and I allowed myself a small exhale. But the relief didn't last long. The plane jolted sharply to the left, a sudden, gut-wrenching tilt that yanked my focus back to the yoke. I corrected quickly, leveling us out, but my pulse was racing now. The storm was throwing everything it had at us, gusts from nowhere, unexpected downdrafts, turbulence that made it feel like the plane was fighting me at every turn. My hands were shaking, but I gripped tighter, locking my arms to keep the movement steady. I couldn't afford to show weakness, not even to myself. Flight 739, we're tracking a severe cell directly ahead. The controller's voice broke in again, crackling slightly over the static. If possible, divert 20 degrees west. I glanced at the radar. The cell they were talking about was massive. A swirling yellow and red monster that loomed dead ahead. Diverting meant flying through a narrower channel between two smaller cells, and it wasn't a guarantee that we'd avoid the worst of it. My stomach churned. I hated making these calls, but I had no choice. I adjusted the heading, nudging the yoke to the left, and watched as the plane slowly turned. The storm responded almost immediately. The turbulence grew sharper, the plane rocking and shuddering, as though it knew we were trying to outmaneuver it. My shoulders ached from the tension. My grip so tight it felt like the yoke was fused to my hands. The controls fought back, every adjustment feeling like a tug of war. I glanced at the artificial horizon again, checking our angle, then back at the radar. The smaller cells on our new path didn't look much better. I gritted my teeth. There was no way out but through. Lightning cracked again, so close I could swear I felt the heat of it. The thunder came immediately after, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the plane to its core. I flinched, instinctively ducking as if it could reach me in the cockpit. The plane bucked wildly, and for a split second, it felt like the controls wouldn't respond. Then I pulled back, eased the throttle, and the plane steadied again. I let out a shaky breath, the sound barely audible over the engine's roar. My neck and shoulders were stiff from the constant strain. My pulse pounded in my ears, a reminder that I was very much alive, and very much not out of danger yet. The radio crackled, another instruction from the controller, but I barely registered it. My focus was on the instruments, the way the needle on the altimeter wavered, the steady glow of the airspeed indicator. I repeated the instructions back automatically, my voice steady out of necessity, not confidence. My hands moved almost on their own, adjusting the trim, nudging the yoke, tweaking the throttle. I was running on instinct now, on the years of training that had drilled these movements into me. But no training could fully prepare you for a storm like this, for the sheer force of nature, doing its best to knock you out of the sky. Another gust hit, and the plane rolled slightly to the right. I corrected immediately, but the adrenaline rush hit me hard. My throat was dry, my muscles burned from the effort. I blinked hard, forcing my vision to stay clear. The storm was relentless, and it was only going to get worse. I could feel it. I didn't need the radar to tell me that we were heading into the heart of it now. The sky outside was alive with flashes and streaks, the rain hitting harder, the turbulence like a living thing, unpredictable and merciless. I thought briefly of the faces in the cabin, the passengers relying on me to keep us steady, to get us through this. I didn't know them, but their safety was my responsibility. The weight of that pressed on me more heavily than the storm outside. I couldn't let them down. I couldn't fail. I swallowed hard, adjusted the heading again, and focused on the instruments. The storm might have been raging, but I was still in control barely, but still. And as long as I was, there was hope. The cockpit was chaos, but controlled chaos. My hands were glued to the yoke, my knuckles aching from the relentless grip I held as the plane rocked and swayed through the storm's furious grip. Each burst of turbulence sent a ripple through my chest, a reminder of just how high the stakes were. The radio buzzed faintly in my headset, the voice of air traffic control, calm and steady. They sounded so distant, like they were sitting comfortably in some well-lit tower far away, watching my struggle on a glowing screen. I muttered my responses into the mic, repeating their instructions even as another violent jolt slammed the plane sideways. My heart leapt into my throat, but my hands held steady, pulling us back to level flight. The instruments were my lifeline now, glowing dials that showed I was still in control, even as the storm outside tried to wrestle it all away. Rain pelted the windshield, streaking sideways in silvery sheets. The lightning was relentless, illuminating the darkness outside in fleeting, blinding bursts. For a split second, I could see the storm clouds churning angry gray masses that seemed to reach for us with jagged, glowing fingers. The thunder rolled in right after, a booming roar that vibrated through my bones. I gritted my teeth, focusing on the artificial horizon as the plane wavered. My breaths were shallow, quick, every muscle in my body locked with tension. I could hear faint creaks and groans from the aircraft, the sound of the wind battering against the metal skin of the plane. It felt like the storm was alive, testing me, waiting for me to falter. I thought of the passengers behind me, families, couples, strangers thrown together by chance. I couldn't hear them, but I could picture their fear. I imagined the looks they exchanged, the way they probably gripped the armrests, hoping each bump wouldn't be the one that sent them tumbling. In some strange way, that image steadied me. I couldn't let them down. I wasn't just flying the plane, I was holding their lives in my hands. The storm could rage all it wanted, but I wasn't about to let it win. My grip tightened, my eyes flicking between the altimeter and the radar. The swirling blobs of green and yellow on the screen told me this wasn't going to be over anytime soon. Flight 739, you're entering a severe turbulence zone, came the controller's voice. Be prepared for downdrafts and sudden changes in altitude. I responded automatically, keeping my tone even, but inside I was bracing myself. Another jolt hit harder this time, and I felt the plane drop suddenly before I could correct it. My stomach turned, and for a moment, it felt like we were in freefall. Then my training kicked in. I pulled back gently, leveling us out, adjusting the throttle and the trim. The plane steadied, but the storm didn't let up. It was like being caught in a boxing match, every punch landing harder than the last. I couldn't see my reflection in the windshield anymore. Only the streaks of rain and the faint glow of the instruments. I didn't need to see myself to know my face was set, my jaw clenched, my eyes scanning everything, looking for the slightest hint that the storm was easing. But it wasn't. I remembered the last time I'd flown through something this bad. It had been years ago, during training, an instructor sitting beside me, coaching me through every move. But this wasn't training. There was no instructor, no second set of hands on the controls. It was just me, the storm, and the responsibility of keeping us alive. I shook the thought away, forcing myself to focus on the now. The storm might have been merciless, but I wasn't helpless. I adjusted the heading again, trying to skirt the edge of the worst of it. Every small movement counted. Every small movement felt like a fight. The turbulence came in waves, brief moments of relative calm followed by sudden, gut-wrenching drops. My hands worked instinctively, adjusting the plane's pitch, nudging the yoke to keep us level. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the cockpit in stark white light. For an instant, everything seemed frozen, my hands on the controls, the instruments glowing steadily. The streaks of rain on the windshield. Then the darkness returned, and I was back in the fight. The altimeter ticked down as I followed the controller's instructions to descend. The airspeed indicator held steady, a small reassurance that I was doing something right. Flight 739, confirm your altitude and airspeed, came another calm instruction. I replied without hesitation, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through me. I had to sound calm, even if I didn't feel it. The passengers didn't need to hear panic. They needed to hear control. They needed to know someone up here had a plan. And I did. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. If I followed the procedures, if I trusted my training, if I stayed focused, I could get us through this. The storm wasn't going to last forever. It couldn't. The next jolt was so sharp that it threw me against the seat harness. My chest hit the straps hard, knocking the wind out of me for a second. I gritted my teeth, pulling back on the yoke, adjusting the trim again. The plane steadied, but only barely. I blinked, trying to keep my vision clear. The radio crackled again, a lifeline of calm in the chaos. I didn't need the words so much as the sound, something steady, something predictable. I responded automatically, my hands working the controls as if they had a mind of their own. The turbulence was relentless, but so was I. I had to be. The storm outside was a constant barrage, lightning, thunder, rain slamming against the glass. Inside, the cockpit was a cocoon of determination. I couldn't let myself think about the what-ifs. What if I made a mistake? What if I couldn't hold the plane steady? What if the storm was stronger than me? I shoved those thoughts aside, focusing on the instruments, on the sound of the engines, on the feel of the yoke in my hands. My hands ached, my muscles burned, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. Flight 739, you're approaching a break in the storm. The controller's voice came through, calm and measured. Maintain current heading, and begin a gradual descent to 12,000 feet. The words were like a beacon of hope. I repeated them back, adjusting the controls. The altimeter needle started to drop again, but this time, it felt like a step toward safety. I still had to get through the remaining turbulence, still had to fight for every inch. But I could feel the storm loosening its grip. The cockpit wasn't quite as dark now. The lightning was less frequent, the rain less intense. It was still a fight, but I was winning. I could feel it. The instruments held steady, the altimeter ticking down as I descended. My breaths were still shallow, my chest tight, but I kept going. One adjustment at a time, one moment at a time. The storm wasn't done with us yet, but I could see the end. I could see the way through. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I let myself believe we might just make it. The cockpit was lit by the glow of the instruments, their steady light in stark contrast to the storm that raged beyond the windshield. I sat there, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the yoke they were starting to cramp. my arms aching from holding the plane steady against the relentless turbulence. Every muscle in my body was tense, my pulse pounding in my ears. Outside, the sky flashed white again, lightning cutting through the clouds like jagged blades. The thunder followed almost instantly, a rolling boom that seemed to vibrate through the entire fuselage. The plane shuddered violently, as if the storm were trying to shake us loose from the sky. I gritted my teeth and adjusted the controls, trying to level us out, but it felt like wrestling with a force of nature. My heart raced, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, soaking into my shirt. The air in the cockpit was warm and stale, heavy with the smell of metal and plastic, and I could feel my breaths coming faster, shallow. I forced myself to take one deep inhale, then another, trying to keep my hands steady. The instruments in front of me showed we were still on course barely. The radar display was a swirling mess of green and yellow, with darker splotches of red that I tried to steer us away from. But the storm wasn't letting us go. It was alive, relentless, like it knew what I was doing, and was determined to push back harder. Each time I thought I had the plane under control, another violent gust would hit, throwing us off balance, sending me scrambling to correct. I could hear the engines roaring, the sound of the wind howling outside, the faint creaks and groans of the plane's frame as it endured each hit. This wasn't just turbulence, this was a full-on assault, the storm throwing everything it had at us. And I was the only thing standing between it and everyone on board. The radio crackled again, air traffic control's calm voice cutting through the noise. Flight 739, continue your descent to 10,000 feet. You're approaching a break in the storm. Adjust heading to 270. I acknowledged, my voice steady, but my hands trembled as I reached for the controls. I nudged the plane into the turn, watching the artificial horizon shift, as we banked to the left. The nose dipped slightly, and I pulled back just enough to keep our descent gradual. The altimeter ticked down, the numbers slowly falling, and I adjusted the trim to keep us stable. But the storm wasn't done with us. Another sudden jolt hit, harder than the last, and I heard a metallic clatter behind me. Something had come loose in the cabin. My stomach flipped as the plane dropped sharply for what felt like an eternity, before I managed to pull it back up. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to react, not to show fear. I couldn't afford that luxury. Not now. I glanced at the radar again. The path ahead was tight, a narrow gap between two massive storm cells. I had to time it just right, turn too soon or too late, and we'd be swallowed by the storm's worst fury. My hands moved instinctively, adjusting the heading, the throttle, the trim. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and absolutely necessary. There was no room for error. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the cockpit in a stark white light that made me blink. The thunder followed immediately, shaking the plane. My heart jumped in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I focused on the instruments, on the numbers, on the feel of the controls. I couldn't let the fear get to me. I had to be the calm in the chaos. The turbulence hit again, a bone-jarring shake that made me grit my teeth. I kept my grip steady, my arms locked as I fought to keep the plane level. The altimeter continued its steady descent, the needle creeping closer to 10,000 feet. My headset crackled again, another instruction from the controller, but I barely heard it. My focus was on the controls, on keeping us on course. The storm was relentless, but I could see the edge of it on the radar now. The gap was close, just a few more miles. My hands moved automatically, making small adjustments, steering us through the worst of it. The instruments told me we were still in the air, still stable enough to make it. But it was hard to believe that when the plane was bucking like a wild horse under me. I could feel every muscle in my body screaming for relief, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I thought of the people in the cabin behind me, the passengers, who had no choice but to trust that I could get them through this. I imagined them gripping the armrests, whispering prayers, holding their loved ones close. They didn't know me, didn't know what I was going through up here. All they knew was that they were in a storm, and I was their only chance of making it out. That thought kept me focused. It kept my hands steady, my mind sharp. I couldn't let them down. Not now. Not ever. The plane jolted again, a hard shove that made me tighten my grip on the yoke. My shoulders ached from the effort, my neck stiff from holding my head forward. I adjusted the heading once more, watching the artificial horizon tilt slightly, then level out again. I was so close now, so close to breaking free of the storm's grip. The radar showed the gap just ahead, a narrow line of calmer air that felt like a promise of relief. But the storm was making me fight for every inch. I swallowed hard, blinking away the sweat that dripped into my eyes. My hands moved with purpose, every adjustment deliberate. I couldn't think about what would happen if I failed. I couldn't let that thought enter my mind. I had to believe I could do this. I had to trust my training, my instincts, my ability to stay calm under pressure. The passengers were counting on me, and I wasn't about to let them down. Another flash of lightning, another deafening roll of thunder. The rain pounded against the windshield like it was trying to break through. The turbulence came in waves now, each one threatening to throw us off course. Each one met with a small, precise movement of the controls to keep us steady. My arms felt like lead, my hands numb from holding the yoke so tightly. But I didn't let go. I couldn't. I was the only thing keeping this plane in the air, the only thing keeping us alive. The controller's voice crackled in my ear again, calm and steady. Flight 739, you're almost clear of the storm. Hold your current heading and maintain your descent to 10,000 feet. Almost clear. The words sent a small wave of relief through me, but I didn't let it show. I couldn't afford to relax, not yet. I adjusted the trim once more, watching the altimeter tick downward. The storm wasn't done with us, not yet, but I could see the end now. It was there, just ahead, just a few more miles. I could do this. I had to do this. The plane bucked again, another sharp jolt that made me clench my jaw. But I held steady, my hands firm, my eyes on the instruments. I was tired, my body aching, my mind racing, but I wasn't going to give up. Not now. I was in control, and I was going to see this through. The storm could throw whatever it wanted at me. I wasn't letting go. I was getting us out. The roar of the engines was deafening now, a relentless background noise that vibrated through my entire body. My hands were frozen on the yoke, my knuckles white, every muscle screaming from the constant tension. It felt like the plane was fighting me, every slight adjustment met with resistance. Every attempt to steady the wings just a temporary win against the storm's furious power. Outside, the world had become an endless gray void. Rain pounding against the windshield. Streaks of water cutting across the glass as the wipers struggled to keep up. I could barely see beyond the nose of the aircraft, just the occasional flash of lightning tearing through the darkness, illuminating the clouds in stark, jagged outlines. For a second at a time, the storm's immense scale was visible, its churning depths threatening to engulf us. Then the darkness returned, leaving only the glowing dials and gauges inside the cockpit as my guide. The instruments were my lifeline. Altitude, airspeed, artificial horizon all glowing steadily, unwavering despite the chaos outside. My eyes darted from one to the next, reading, adjusting, reacting in a constant rhythm. The altimeter showed a slow descent, a deliberate drop toward clearer air below. But the turbulence made every inch feel like a fight. Each jolt sent my stomach lurching, and I gritted my teeth, adjusting the trim, holding the plane steady against the storm's unrelenting force. I could feel the plane's frame shudder with each gust of wind, the occasional groan of metal under strain cutting through the constant hum of the engines. My shoulders ached from holding steady, my back pressed firmly against the seat, my legs braced as if I could somehow will the plane to stay level. Every second felt like a minute, every minute an hour. The storm was merciless. The radio crackled again, air traffic control's calm voice reaching me through the noise. Flight 739 continued descent to 9,000 feet. Adjust heading to 265. Weather ahead is showing some improvement. Improvement. The word felt distant, almost meaningless in the face of what I was battling. I acknowledged the instructions, my voice calm, and measured an instinct drilled into me over years of training. No matter what was happening around me, I adjusted the heading slightly, the plane's nose shifting to the left, the instruments responding smoothly. But the storm didn't care about smoothness. Another violent gust hit, sending the plane into a brief roll before I corrected. My arms were burning now. Every small movement of the controls a deliberate effort. I could feel the sweat on my palms, my grip slipping slightly, and I wiped one hand quickly on my pants before returning it to the yoke. Lightning flashed again, brighter this time, so close I could almost feel the heat. The cockpit lit up like daylight for a split second, and I saw my reflection in the windshield, tense, focused, eyes locked on the instruments. Then the light was gone, and the rain resumed its relentless attack, hammering against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. I blinked, forcing my vision to stay clear, shaking my head slightly to refocus. I couldn't let myself get distracted. Not by the storm, not by the fear that threatened to creep in. My mind had to stay sharp, my movements precise. Every adjustment mattered. Every degree of heading, every notch of throttle, it all had to be perfect. The turbulence was relentless. The plane bucked and shuddered, each jolt making it feel like we were on the verge of losing control. I fought to keep us steady, my hands moving instinctively, every motion practiced and deliberate. The artificial horizon showed us level, but the constant motion made it hard to believe. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse racing in my ears. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, keeping me focused, keeping me sharp. But the fatigue was there too, creeping in around the edges. I had been fighting this storm for what felt like an eternity, and my body was starting to feel the toll. My arms ached, my neck stiff from holding my head forward, my lower back sore from sitting so rigidly. But I didn't let up. I couldn't let up. There was no room for error, no time for rest. The storm wasn't done with us yet. I glanced at the radar, the screen a swirling mass of green and yellow, with flashes of red that seemed to pulse as the storm cells moved. The gap ahead, the one that Control had mentioned, was visible now. A thin corridor of calmer air between two massive cells. It was our way out, our only shot at getting through this alive. But it was narrow, and the storm on either side was growing more intense. I adjusted the heading again, turning slightly to align us with the gap, my hands moving quickly and precisely. The plane responded, but the turbulence made every movement feel like a gamble. I was working against forces I couldn't see, couldn't predict, only react to in the moment. Flight 739, you're on course. Descend to 8,000 feet. The controller's voice came through again. I repeated the instruction, my voice steady despite the shaking of the plane. I eased back on the throttle, letting the nose dip slightly, the altimeter ticking downward. The instruments held steady, their glow a reassuring presence in the chaos. I watched the artificial horizon carefully, ensuring we stayed level, keeping a close eye on the airspeed indicator. The numbers were my anchor, the only thing that felt real in the storm's chaos. I trusted them. Trusted my training. Trusted the years I'd spent learning to handle moments like this. But this was unlike anything I'd faced before. The gap ahead grew closer, but the turbulence worsened. The plane rocked violently, a sudden downdraft sending us into a brief but stomach-turning drop. I corrected quickly, pulling back gently on the yoke, easing us back to level flight. My heart was in my throat, my breath short and quick. I glanced at the radar again, seeing the narrow path just ahead. We were almost there, almost out of the worst of it. But the storm was making us fight for every inch. I could feel my muscles straining, my arms shaking with the effort, but I didn't let go. I held on, kept my movements steady, my mind focused on the instruments, on the numbers, on the goal. We were going to make it. We had to make it. The lightning flashed again, another deafening crack of thunder following immediately. The storm's fury was all around us, but I kept my eyes on the instruments, my hands on the controls. The gap was just ahead, and I could feel the air starting to smooth out slightly. Not calm, not yet, but better. I adjusted the heading one final time, aligning us perfectly with the corridor of calmer air. The altimeter ticked down to 8,000 feet, the plane holding steady now. The turbulence easing just enough to feel like we could breathe again. I let out a slow, controlled exhale, my hands still tight on the yoke. We were almost through. Just a little further, and we'd be clear of the storm's grip. I could feel it. I could see it on the radar, the gap widening, the red and yellow fading to green. We were going to make it. I just had to hold steady for a little longer. As I finally leveled the plane, a feeling of cautious relief started to spread through me. I had managed to navigate us through the worst of the storm, but the fight wasn't over. The clouds were still thick, the air still unsteady, but the instruments now showed clear skies just a few miles ahead. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself a deep breath. It was shaky, sure, but it was still a breath. The radio crackled, the controller's voice coming through again, still calm, still measured. Flight 739, You're through the worst. Maintain heading 265. Descent to 5,000 feet approved. I repeated the instructions back to them, and as I did, I realized my hands were starting to cramp. My fingers were stiff from gripping the yoke so tightly, my knuckles white. I forced myself to ease up, to relax my grip just a little. My body was still tense, my heart still pounding, but I knew I had to keep it together. I had gotten us this far, I wasn't about to lose it now. The plane trembled slightly as we descended, but it was nothing compared to what we'd just been through. I glanced at the radar, watching the green blobs fade into smaller, scattered patches. The storm's grip was loosening. I adjusted the throttle, easing the descent, trying to keep everything as smooth as possible. The artificial horizon held steady, the altimeter ticking down at a controlled pace. We were moving toward safety, toward clearer skies. The thought should have been comforting, but my mind was racing. There was no room for complacency, no time to relax. I kept my eyes on the instruments, my hands on the controls. I didn't look away. I couldn't afford to. Every second mattered. Every small movement on the yoke was critical. Outside, the rain had finally started to let up. I could see glimpses of lighter sky through the thinning clouds, faint patches of blue peeking through. The occasional beam of sunlight broke through, casting sharp contrasts on the horizon. The storm was still there, still behind us, but it was no longer our world. We were moving out of its reach. I could feel the difference in the air, the way the plane handled. It was subtle, but I could tell. The controls were responding more smoothly, the turbulence less violent. I adjusted the heading slightly, lining us up with the approach path to the runway ahead. My breathing steadied a little more. The passengers behind me were quiet now, probably still gripping their seats, still holding their breath. I couldn't hear them, but I knew they were there, waiting for me to land this plane. The runway was in sight now, a long stretch of black against the lighter horizon. The controller's voice returned, giving me clearance to land. I repeated the clearance back, my voice steady, but inside I was still fighting to stay calm. The approach was critical. Even after everything we'd been through, this moment was the one that would determine if we made it down safely. I began the final descent, adjusting the flaps, reducing speed, lining us up perfectly. The instruments showed we were on target. I glanced at the airspeed indicator, then back at the artificial horizon. Everything was holding steady. I could feel the plane responding, every adjustment smooth and precise. My hands moved without hesitation, each motion deliberate. This was it. The wheels touched down with a sharp jolt, the tires gripping the runway. I braced myself as the plane shuddered, the brakes engaging, the engines roaring as I brought the speed down. The force pushed me back into the seat, but I held steady, keeping the plane centered on the runway. My hands stayed firm on the controls as we slowed, the tension in my body refusing to let go until we were finally rolling safely toward the taxiway. The engine noise faded, the vibrations eased, and for the first time, the cockpit was calm. I flipped a few switches, disengaging the autopilot, bringing the plane to a complete stop. My hands left the yoke, and I realized they were trembling. I let them fall to my lap, took another deep breath, and closed my eyes for a moment. It was done. We were on the ground. The radio crackled again, the controller congratulating me on a successful landing. I muttered a thank you, but the words felt distant, almost unreal. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, my heart still pounding. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the co-pilot's seat empty. Of course. It had been just me. Just me in the storm. And now, me in the silence. The passengers would be filing off soon, their relief probably turning into nervous laughter and phone calls to loved ones. I could almost hear it now. You won't believe what happened on our flight. But in this moment, I didn't need their applause or their thanks. I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd done well. The fact that we were here, on solid ground, was enough. I sat back in the seat, letting the weight of the past hours sink in. My body was heavy, my muscles aching, but I didn't move just yet. I stared out at the runway, at the faint shimmer of heat rising off the asphalt in the distance. The sky was almost clear now, a pale blue stretching endlessly above. The storm was behind us, its fury nothing but a memory. I felt the tension start to drain away, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Not joy, not pride, just relief. The kind of relief that comes from knowing you've made it through something you weren't sure you could handle. I thought about what had just happened, about the choices I'd made, the moments where everything had felt on the brink of collapse. The doubts I'd pushed aside, the fear I'd swallowed down. It was all still there, just below the surface, but it didn't matter now. The job was done. I'd done it. I wasn't sure what that meant yet, wasn't sure how I'd feel when I finally stepped out of the cockpit and onto the tarmac. But I knew one thing for certain. I'd brought us home. I'd done what had to be done, and nothing, no storm, no fear, no doubt could take that away from me. Did you see that coming? Everything changed in the blink of an eye, and the outcome wasn't what anyone expected. I never imagined I'd end up in that cockpit, fighting for the lives of everyone on board, including the very person who had doubted me the most. This was about more than just landing a plane. It was about proving that no matter how many times you've been dismissed or underestimated, you have the strength to rise above. What's your takeaway from this? Would you have made the same choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to hear what you think. When I look back on what I went through, it all comes down to one thing: resilience. Life will throw storms your way, unexpected, relentless, and unforgiving. But you have to stay steady, adapt, and trust yourself. I learned that even when it feels like everything's against you, keeping a clear head and making deliberate decisions can lead you out of the chaos. In America, we pride ourselves on strength and determination, and this experience showed me that anyone, no matter their situation, can rise above. If I can hold on through that storm, so can you. Never give up, and always believe in your ability to make it through.